2. Combray. Part II. Combray. 3. The church, a dear familiar friend, close pressed in the Rue Saint Hilaire, upon which its north door opened, by its two neighbours, Madame Loiseau's house and the pharmacy of Monsieur Repin, against which its walls rested, without interspace. A simple citizen of Combray, who might have had her number in the street, had the streets of Combray borne numbers, and at whose door one felt that the postman ought to stop on his morning rounds before going into Madame Loiseau's and after leaving Monsieur Rapin's. There existed for all that, between the church and everything else in Combray that was not the church, a clear line of demarcation which I have never succeeded in eliminating from my mind. In vain might Madame Loiseau deck her window sills with fuchsias, which developed the bad habit of letting their branches trail at all times and in all directions, head downwards, and whose flowers had no more important business when they were big enough to taste the joys of life than to go and cool their purple, congested cheeks against the dark front of the church. To me such conduct sanctified the fuchsias not at all. Between the flowers and the blackened stones towards which they leaned, if my eyes could discern no interval, my mind preserved the impression of an abyss. From a long way off one could distinguish and identify the steeple of Saint Hilaire, inscribing its unforgettable form upon a horizon beneath which Combray had not yet appeared. When from the train which brought us down from Paris at Easter time my father caught sight of it, as it slipped into every fold of the sky in turn, its little iron cock veering continually in all directions, he would say, "Come, get your wraps together, we are there." And on one of the longest walks we ever took from Combray there was a spot where the narrow road emerged suddenly on to an immense plain, closed at the horizon by strips of forest over which rose and stood alone the fine point of Saint Hilaire's steeple, but so sharpened and so pink that it seemed to be no more than sketched on the sky by the finger nail of a painter, anxious to give to such a landscape, to so pure a piece of nature, this little sign of art, this single indication of human existence. As one drew near it and could make out the remains of the square tower half in ruins, which still stood by its side, though without rivalling it in height, one was struck, first of all, by the tone, reddish and sombre, of its stones, and on a misty morning in autumn one would have called it, to see it rising above the violet thundercloud of the vineyards, a ruin of purple, almost the colour of the wild vine. Often in the square as we came home, my grandmother would make me stop to look up at it. From the tower windows, placed two and two, one pair above another, with that right and original proportion in their spacing to which not only human faces owe their beauty and dignity, it let fall at regular intervals flights of jackdaws, which for a little while would wheel and caw, as though the ancient stones which allowed them to sport thus and never seemed to see them, becoming of a sudden uninhabitable and discharging some infinitely disturbing element, had struck them and driven them forth. Then, after patterning everywhere the violet velvet of the evening air, abruptly soothed, they would return and be absorbed in the tower, deadly no longer, but benignant, some perching here and there, not seeming to move, but snapping perhaps and swallowing some passing insect, on the points of turrets, as a seagull perches, with an angler's immobility, on the crest of a wave. Without quite knowing why, my grandmother found in the steeple of Saint Hilaire that absence of vulgarity, pretension, and meanness which made her love, and deem rich in beneficent influences, nature itself, when the hand of man had not, as did my great aunt's gardener, trimmed it, and the works of genius. And certainly every part one saw of the church served to distinguish the whole from any other building by a kind of general feeling which pervaded it. But it was in the steeple that the church seemed to display a consciousness of itself, to affirm its individual and responsible existence. It was the steeple which spoke for the church. I think, too, that in a confused way my grandmother found in the steeple of Combray what she prized above anything else in the world, namely, a natural air and an air of distinction. Ignorant of architecture, she would say, "My dears, laugh at me if you like. It's not conventionally beautiful, but there is something in its quaint old face which pleases me. If it could play the piano, I am sure it would really play." And when she gazed on it, when her eyes followed the gentle tension, the fervent inclination of its stony slopes which drew together as they rose, like hands joined in prayer, she would absorb herself so utterly in the outpouring of the spire that her gaze seemed to leap upwards with it, her lips at the same time curving in a friendly smile for the worn old stones of which the setting sun now illumined no more than the topmost pinnacles, which, at the point where they entered that zone of sunlight and were softened and sweetened by it, seemed to have mounted suddenly far higher, to have become truly remote, like a song whose singer breaks into falsetto an octave above the accompanying air. It was the steeple of St. Hilaire which shaped and crowned and consecrated every occupation, every hour of the day, every point of view in the town. From my bedroom window I could discern no more than its base, which had been freshly covered with slates. But when on Sundays I saw these, in the hot light of a summer morning, blaze like a black sun, I would say to myself, "Good heavens! 9 o'clock! I must get ready for mass at once if I am to have time to go in and kiss Aunt Léonie first." And I would know exactly what was the colour of the sunlight upon the square. I could feel the heat and dust of the market, the shade behind the blinds of the shop into which Mamma would perhaps go on her way to mass, penetrating its odour of unbleached calico to purchase a handkerchief or something, of which the draper himself would let her see what he had, bowing from the waist, who, having made everything ready for shutting up, had just gone into the back shop to put on his Sunday coat and to wash his hands, which it was his habit every few minutes, and even on the saddest occasions, to rub one against the other with an air of enterprise, cunning, and success. And again after Mass, when we looked in to tell Theodore to bring a larger loaf than usual, because our cousins had taken advantage of the fine weather to come over from Tiberzy for luncheon, we had in front of us the steeple, which, baked and brown itself like a larger loaf still of holy bread, with flakes and sticky drops on it of sunlight, pricked its sharp point into the blue sky. And in the evening, as I came in from my walk and thought of the approaching moment when I must say good night to my mother and see her no more, the steeple was by contrast so kindly there at the close of day that I would imagine it as being laid, like a brown velvet cushion, against, as being thrust into the pallid sky, which had yielded beneath its pressure, had sunk slightly so as to make room for it, and had correspondingly risen on either side, while the cries of the birds wheeling to and fro about it seemed to intensify its silence, to elongate its spire still further, and to invest it with some quality beyond the power of words. Even when our errands lay in places behind the church, from which it could not be seen, the view seemed always to have been composed with reference to the steeple, which would stand up now here, now there, among the houses, and was perhaps even more affecting when it appeared thus without the church. And indeed there are many others which look best when seen in this way, and I can call to mind vignettes of housetops with surmounting steeples in quite another category of art than those formed by the dreary streets of Combray. I shall never forget, in a quaint Norman town not far from Balbec, two charming 18th-century houses, dear to me and venerable for many reasons, between which, when one looks up at them from a fine garden which descends in terraces to the river, the Gothic spire of a church, itself hidden by the houses, soars into the sky with the effect of crowning and completing their fronts, but in a material so different, so precious, so beringed, so rosy, so polished, that it is at once seen to be no more a part of them than would be a part of two pretty pebbles lying side by side, between which it had been washed on the beach, the purple, crinkled spire of some sea-shell spun out into a turret and gay with glossy colour. Even in Paris, in one of the ugliest parts of the town, I know a window from which one can see across a first, a second, and even a third layer of jumbled roofs, street beyond street, a violet bell, sometimes ruddy, sometimes, too, in the finest prints which the atmosphere makes of it, of an ashy solution of black, which is, in fact, nothing else than the dome of St. Augustin, and which imparts to this view of Paris the character of some of the Piranesi views of Rome. But since into none of these little etchings, whatever the taste my memory may have been able to bring to their execution, was it able to contribute an element I have long lost, the feeling which makes us not merely regard a thing as a spectacle, but believe in it as in a creature without parallel, So none of them keeps in dependence on it a whole section of my inmost life, as does the memory of those aspects of the steeple of Combray from the streets behind the church. Whether one saw it at 5 o'clock when going to call for letters at the post office, some doors away from one, on the left, raising abruptly with its isolated peak the ridge of housetops, or again when one had to go in and ask for news of Madame Sazerat, one's eyes followed the line where it ran low again beyond the farther descending slope, and one knew that it would be the second turning after the steeple. Or yet again, if pressing further afield one went to the station, one saw it obliquely, showing in profile fresh angles and surfaces, like a solid body surprised at some unknown point in its revolution. Or from the banks of the Vivonne, the apse, drawn muscularly together and heightened in perspective, seemed to spring upwards with the effort which the steeple made to hurl its spire point into the heart of heaven. It was always to the steeple that one must return, always it which dominated everything else, summing up the houses with an unexpected pinnacle, raised before me like the finger of God, whose body might have been concealed below among the crowd of human bodies, without fear of my confounding it for that reason with them. And so even today in any large provincial town, or in a quarter of Paris which I do not know well, if a passer by who is putting me on the right road shows me from afar, as a point to aim at, some belfry of a hospital, or a convent steeple lifting the peak of its ecclesiastical cap at the corner of the street which I am to take, my memory need only find in it some dim resemblance to that dear and vanished outline, and the passer by, should he turn round to make sure that I have not gone astray, would see me, to his astonishment, oblivious of the walk that I had planned to take, or the place where I was obliged to call, standing still on the spot before that steeple for hours on end, motionless, trying to remember, feeling deep within myself a tract of soil reclaimed from the waters of Lethe, slowly drying until the buildings rise on it again. And then, no doubt, and then more uneasily than when, just now, I asked him for a direction, I will seek my way again. I will turn a corner, but the goal is in my heart. On our way home from Mass we would often meet Monsieur Legrandin, who, detained in Paris by his professional duties as an engineer, could only, except in the regular holiday seasons, visit his home at Combray between Saturday evenings and Monday mornings. He was one of that class of men who, apart from a scientific career in which they may well have proved brilliantly successful, have acquired an entirely different kind of culture, literary or artistic, of which they make no use in the specialized work of their profession, but by which their conversation profits. More literary than many men of letters, we were not aware at this period that Monsieur Legrandin had a distinct reputation as a writer, and so were greatly astonished to find that a well-known composer had set some verses of his to music. Endowed with a greater ease in execution than many painters, they imagine that the life they are obliged to lead is not that for which they are really fitted, and they bring to their regular occupations either a fantastic indifference or a sustained and lofty application, scornful, bitter, and conscientious. Tall, with a good figure, a fine, thoughtful face, drooping fair moustaches, a look of disillusionment in his blue eyes, an almost exaggerated refinement of courtesy, a talker such as we had never heard, he was in the sight of my family, who never ceased to quote him as an example, the very pattern of a gentleman, who took life in the noblest and most delicate manner. My grandmother alone found fault with him for speaking a little too well, a little too much like a book, for not using a vocabulary as natural as his loosely knotted Lavalière neckties, his short, straight, almost schoolboyish coat. She was astonished, too, at the furious invective which he was always launching at the aristocracy, at fashionable life and snobbishness. "Undoubtedly," he would say, "the sin of which St. Paul is thinking when he speaks of the sin for which there is no forgiveness." Worldly ambition was a thing which my grandmother was so little capable of feeling, or indeed of understanding, that it seemed to her futile to apply so much heat to its condemnation. Besides, she thought it in not very good taste that Monsieur Legrandin, whose sister was married to a country gentleman of Lower Normandy near Balbec, should deliver himself of such violent attacks upon the nobles, going so far as to blame the Revolution for not having guillotined them all. "Well met, my friends," he would say as he came towards us. You are lucky to spend so much time here. To morrow I have to go back to Paris, to squeeze back into my niche. Oh, I admit," he went on, with his own peculiar smile, gently ironical, disillusioned and vague, "I have every useless thing in the world in my house there. The only thing wanting is the necessary thing, a great patch of open sky like this. Always try to keep a patch of sky above your life, little boy," he added, turning to me. "You have a soul in you of rare quality, an artist's nature. Never let it starve for lack of what it needs." When, on our reaching the house, my aunt would send to ask us whether Madame Goupil had indeed arrived late for mass, not one of us could inform her. Instead, we increased her anxiety by telling her that there was a painter at work in the church copying the window of Gilbert the Bad. Françoise was at once dispatched to the grocer's, but returned empty-handed, owing to the absence of Theodore, whose dual profession of choirman, with a part in the maintenance of the fabric, and of grocer's assistant, gave him not only relations with all sections of society, but an encyclopaedic knowledge of their affairs. "Ah," my aunt would sigh, "I wish it were time for Eulalie to come. She is really the only person who will be able to tell me." End of Part Two, Section 3.